At 55, Margaret Sinclair thought she'd long passed any hope of love in the harsh Arizona territory of 1879, especially when the town's whispers branded her a foolish old woman, trying to snare the widowed rancher, Daniel Morrison. But when she tried to push him away with those very words, "I'm too old for you," he leaned closer, with eyes full of desperate hope, and whispered, "I've prayed for this." Could a woman's society deemed far past her prime prove that the heart recognizes no age limits when it comes to finding its match? A gunshot cracked through the desert air like a whip, sending Margaret Sinclair's washbucket clattering to the ground. Water splashed across her worn boots as she pressed herself against the adobe wall of Murphy's boarding house, heart hammering in her chest. The Arizona Territory, in 1879, was no place for a 55-year-old woman to be caught outside alone when trouble started. "Easy there, boys," came a deep voice from the dusty street. "Nobody needs to get hurt over a card game." Margaret peered around the corner, squinting against the harsh morning sun. A tall man in a battered cowboy hat stood between two angry gamblers, his hands raised peacefully but ready. His weathered face spoke of years under the desert sun, and something about his calm manner made her breath catch. She'd seen him around town these past few weeks, but never this close. The younger gambler, barely 20 with wild eyes and shaking hands, waved his pistol wildly. "He cheated. I know he did. Son, put that gun down before you hurt yourself," the cowboy said, taking a slow step forward. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from handling dangerous animals and dangerous men. "Nobody's calling you a liar, but nobody's calling Tom a cheat either." Margaret found herself holding her breath. She should go inside, mind her own business like any sensible woman would. But something kept her frozen in place, watching this stranger risk his life for peace in their troubled town. The older gambler, Tom Bradley from the saloon, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Kid can't handle losing fair and square. Been drinking since yesterday." "That's not helping, Tom," the cowboy said, without taking his eyes off the young man's gun. Sweat beaded on the boy's forehead, despite the cool morning air. His finger twitched on the trigger. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as the cowboy took another step closer. One wrong move and blood would soak into the red earth of Main Street. She'd seen it happen before in her 15 years in Copper Creek. Good men died over foolish things every day. "What's your name, son?" the cowboy asked gently. Billy Thompson." The boy's voice cracked like he was still growing into it. "Well, Billy Thompson, I'm Daniel Morrison. I run cattle north of town. You ever work cattle?" The question seemed to confuse Billy. His gun hand wavered slightly. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Everything," Daniel said with a slight smile. "See, when you work cattle, you learn that the loudest bull in the herd ain't always the strongest. Sometimes he's just the most scared." Margaret watched, amazed, as the tension began to drain from Billy's shoulders. This Daniel Morrison had a gift for reading people, for knowing exactly what words would calm a storm. "I ain't scared," Billy muttered, but his gun lowered a few inches. "Course not. But maybe you're tired. Maybe you need some food in your belly and a real job instead of trying to make money at cards." Daniel's voice stayed steady, almost fatherly. "I could use another hand on the ranch. Pays fair, food's good, and nobody cares what mistakes you made yesterday." Tom Bradley snorted. "Daniel, you're too soft for your own good. Kid pulled a gun in the middle of town." "Kid's hungry and desperate," Daniel replied, finally taking his eyes off Billy to glance at Tom. "We've all been there." Margaret felt something twist in her chest at those words. She knew hunger, knew desperation better than most. After losing her husband 12 years ago, she'd survived by cleaning rooms, washing clothes, and pretending she wasn't slowly disappearing into the background of other people's lives. Billy lowered his gun completely, tears making tracks through the dust on his young face. "You really mean it? About the job?" "I mean everything I say," Daniel said, stepping forward to gently take the pistol from Billy's trembling hands. "But first, you're going to apologize to Tom here. Then we're going to get you some breakfast." Margaret found herself smiling despite the lingering fear. When was the last time she'd seen such kindness from a stranger? Most men in Copper Creek minded their own business, looked after their own interests. This Daniel Morrison seemed different. As the small crowd that had gathered began to drift away, Margaret quickly bent to retrieve her wash bucket. She'd been standing there gawking long enough, but as she straightened, she found herself looking directly into a pair of warm brown eyes. Daniel Morrison stood just 10 feet away, his hat now in his hands, revealing hair the color of winter wheat streaked with silver. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 45, with lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as much as worry. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice gentler now, without the need to calm an armed boy. "Hope that little excitement didn't scare you too much." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. At 55, she thought she was past blushing like a schoolgirl. "I've seen worse," she managed to say. Surprised, her voice came out steady. "I imagine you have." His eyes took in her faded dress, her work-worn hands, the wash bucket that marked her as one of the town's working women. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only a kind of gentle curiosity that made her stomach flutter. "I'm Daniel Morrison, Margaret Sinclair." She shifted the bucket to her other hand, suddenly aware of how she must look after a morning of washing other people's clothes. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Sinclair." He paused, and she caught something almost shy in his expression. "Or is it Mrs.?" Was Mrs. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. "My husband passed 12 years ago." Something shifted in Daniel's face, a recognition that made Margaret's breath catch. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know something about that kind of hurt." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, old Murphy came bustling out of the boarding house, his face red with excitement. "Daniel!" heard the commotion. "Everything all right?" "Just a misunderstanding, Murphy. Nothing that couldn't be worked out." Daniel settled his hat back on his head, but his eyes stayed on Margaret's face. "Mrs. Sinclair, I hope we meet again soon." He tipped his hat and walked away, Billy Thompson trailing behind him like a lost puppy who'd found a new master. Margaret stood holding her wash bucket, watching them go, feeling like something important had just happened, but not quite understanding what. "That man's got a gift," Murphy said, shaking his gray head. "Third time this month he's talked someone out of shooting up the town." "Third time?" Margaret asked, still staring down the street where Daniel had disappeared. "Oh yes. Daniel Morrison's got a reputation for fixing trouble without adding to it. Lost his wife about 5 years back, been keeping to himself mostly. But lately," Murphy gave Margaret a meaningful look, "lately, he's been coming to town more often." Margaret felt her heart skip, then immediately scolded herself for being foolish. A man like Daniel Morrison wouldn't be interested in a worn-out widow who cleaned rooms for a living. Still, the way he'd looked at her, like she was someone worth seeing. "I should get back to work," she said, more to herself than to Murphy. But as she carried her bucket inside, Margaret Sinclair found herself wondering about Daniel Morrison and the sadness she'd glimpsed in his warm brown eyes. The morning sun painted the desert red as Margaret walked toward Miller's General Store, her weekly shopping list clutched in one hand and her small savings purse in the other. 3 days had passed since the incident with Billy Thompson, and she hadn't been able to stop thinking about Daniel Morrison's kind eyes and gentle voice. "Foolish old woman," she muttered to herself, stepping carefully around a loose board in the wooden walkway. At 55, she had no business daydreaming about handsome strangers like some silly girl. The bell above Miller's door jangled as she entered, and the familiar smell of coffee beans, leather, and soap wrapped around her like an old blanket. "Mrs. Miller looked up from behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in Margaret's carefully mended dress and worn boots. "Morning, Margaret. The usual supplies?" "Yes, please." Margaret placed her list on the wooden counter, avoiding Mrs. Miller's judgmental stare. Everyone in Copper Creek knew exactly how little money the boarding house widow had to spend. As Mrs. Miller gathered flour, beans, and the cheapest cuts of salt pork, Margaret let her eyes wander around the store. Bolts of pretty fabric lined one wall, colors she hadn't worn in years. A display of hair ribbons caught the morning light, making her touch her own graying hair self-consciously. The doorbell chimed again, and Margaret's heart gave a little jump as Daniel Morrison entered, followed by young Billy Thompson. The boy looked completely different. Clean, shaved, wearing new clothes that actually fit his skinny frame. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," Daniel said, touching his hat brim politely. His eyes found Margaret immediately, and she felt that same flutter in her stomach. "Mrs. Sinclair, what a pleasant surprise." "Mr. Morrison." Margaret managed a small smile, very aware of Mrs. Miller's curious gaze darting between them. "I see young Billy is settling in well." Billy's face broke into a grin that transformed him from dangerous gunfighter to eager boy. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Morrison's teaching me about cattle and horses and proper ranching. I ain't never learned so much in my whole life." "Haven't ever learned," Daniel corrected gently, but his tone was warm. "Grammar's as important as anything else, son." Margaret found herself charmed by this glimpse into Daniel's character. Most ranchers treated their hands like hired muscle. This man clearly saw potential in a troubled young man and was taking the time to nurture it. "Billy, why don't you pick out some new socks and another work shirt?" Daniel suggested, pulling money from his pocket. "Mrs. Miller will help you find the right sizes." As Billy eagerly headed toward the clothing section, with Mrs. Miller fussing over him like a mother hen, Daniel moved closer to Margaret. Up close, she could see the laugh lines around his eyes and catch the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to follow him. "I've been hoping to run into you again," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Have you?" "Yes." He seemed to struggle with something, then took a deep breath. "Mrs. Sinclair, I was wondering if you might allow me to walk you home from church this Sunday." The simple request hit Margaret like a physical blow. When was the last time a man had wanted to escort her anywhere? When was the last time anyone had seen her as more than just the boarding house cleaning woman? Mr. Morrison, I think there's been some misunderstanding." The words tumbled out in a rush, born from years of disappointment and self-doubt. "I'm not. I mean, surely you're not." "Not what?" His brown eyes were patient, encouraging. "I'm 55 years old," she whispered, glancing around to make sure Mrs. Miller and Billy were out of earshot. "I'm too old for courting and carrying on." People would talk. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her squirm. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Sinclair, may I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "When you look in the mirror, what do you see?" The question caught her off guard. What do you mean?" "Do you see a woman who's lived through hard times and come out stronger? Someone who's kept her dignity and kindness even when life knocked her down? Because that's what I see when I look at you." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. No one had spoken to her this way in so long. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than just invisible help. "You don't know anything about me," she said. But the protest came out weak. "I know you stood your ground during that trouble with Billy, even though you were scared. I know you work hard for every penny, but still found a smile for a stranger. I know you've got beautiful eyes that light up when you're not trying to hide behind that wall you've built around yourself." Margaret's breath caught. "Mr. Morrison, Daniel," he said softly, "and I'd very much like to walk you home from church this Sunday, if you'll let me." Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Miller's voice cut through their private moment like a rusty blade. "Well, well, isn't this cozy?" Margaret spun around to find the storekeeper, watching them with sharp, calculating eyes. Billy stood nearby, holding his new clothes, looking confused by the sudden tension in the air. "Mrs. Miller," Daniel said politely, but Margaret caught the warning tone underneath. "Oh, don't mind me," Mrs. Miller said with false sweetness. "Just interesting to see our local hero taking such a particular interest in certain folks around town." Margaret felt her face burn with shame. The implication was clear. What could a man like Daniel Morrison possibly want with an old woman like her except for one unsavory thing. I think, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, you might want to be very careful about what you're suggesting, Mrs. Miller. I'm not suggesting anything, the older woman said, but she took a step backward, just making observations. Margaret gathered her supplies with shaking hands, her moment of hope crashing down around her like a house of cards. This was exactly what she'd feared, exactly why women her age didn't entertain romantic notions. I should go, she said quietly, not looking at Daniel. Margaret, wait. But she was already heading for the door, Mrs. Miller's knowing smirk burning into her back. Outside, the desert sun felt harsh after the cool dimness of the store. Margaret hurried down the wooden walkway, her cheeks flaming with embarrassment. Mrs. Sinclair. Margaret. Daniel's boots echoed on the boards behind her, but she didn't slow down. How could she have been so foolish as to think a man like him could be seriously interested in her? Margaret, please. His hand gently touched her arm, and despite everything, she stopped. Don't let that bitter old woman steal what just happened between us. Margaret turned to face him, tears threatening to spill over. She's not wrong, though, is she? People will talk. They'll say terrible things about both of us. Let them talk. Daniel's eyes blazed with quiet intensity. I've spent 5 years listening to people tell me what I should do, how I should grieve, when I should move on. I'm done living my life according to other people's schedules and judgments. But you're what? Too old, says who? Mrs. Miller? The same woman who's been married to a man who hasn't spoken a kind word to her in 20 years? Daniel shook his head. Margaret, I didn't ask you to walk with me because I felt sorry for you, or because I'm looking for something improper. I asked because something about you makes me want to be a better man than I was yesterday. The raw honesty in his voice nearly undid her. Margaret stared at this man who seemed to see something in her that she'd lost sight of years ago. People our age don't start over, she whispered. Maybe it's time someone proved them wrong, Daniel said softly. What do you say, Margaret? Are you brave enough to walk with me on Sunday? Margaret looked into his warm brown eyes and felt something long buried begin to stir in her chest. Hope was a dangerous thing for a woman her age. But as she stood there in the Arizona sun with Daniel Morrison waiting for her answer, she found she couldn't quite let it go. All right, she said quietly. Sunday. Daniel's smile lit up his whole face, and Margaret Sinclair realized she might be about to find out if second chances were real or just foolish dreams. Margaret's hands shook as she dropped the freshly baked bread into the dust behind the boarding house. 3 days had passed since Daniel's proposal, and the whole town seemed to be watching her every move like vultures circling a dying animal. She had said yes to Daniel Morrison that evening by the old fence post, not with grand words but with a simple nod that felt like jumping off a cliff. The wedding was set for Saturday, just 4 days away now. But as Margaret bent to pick up the ruined loaves, she heard voices drifting from the alley between buildings. 55 years old and acting like a schoolgirl, came Mrs. Patterson's sharp voice. That poor Daniel doesn't know what he's getting himself into. Margaret froze, her heart hammering in her chest like a trapped bird. My herald says she's probably lying about her age, whispered Mrs. Kellerman. Could be 60 for all we know. Women like that, they get desperate. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She pressed herself against the rough adobe wall, hardly daring to breathe. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she could see the 2 women standing in the shade, their faces twisted with gossip and judgment. And the nerve of her, Mrs. Patterson continued, adjusting her fancy hat. Wearing white to the ceremony. White, at her age. It's scandalous. Margaret looked down at the simple, cream-colored dress hanging over her arm, the one she'd spent her savings on just yesterday. It wasn't even truly white, just the color of fresh milk, but suddenly it felt like a costume she had no right to wear. Mark my words, Mrs. Kellerman said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. This whole thing will end in disaster. Old maids who marry late bring nothing but trouble. Look what happened to the Richardson place. after Martha married that traveling preacher. The fire wasn't her fault, Mrs. Patterson replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Wasn't it? Strange how these things happen. Nature has a way of showing displeasure when people go against the proper order of things. Margaret's knees went weak. The Richardson fire had claimed their barn and nearly killed 2 horses. The whole town had talked about it for months. She'd never heard anyone blame Martha Richardson's late marriage, but now the seed was planted in her mind like a poisonous weed. The women's voices faded as they walked away, leaving Margaret alone with her racing thoughts and the ruined bread scattered at her feet. She gathered the dusty loaves mechanically, her mind spinning with doubts that had been growing stronger each day. That afternoon brought no relief. As Margaret walked to the general store for supplies, she noticed how conversations stopped when she passed. Children pointed at her from doorways. Even the dogs seemed to eye her with suspicion. Inside Morrison's mercantile, every teen, no relation to Daniel, despite the name, she tried to purchase fabric for curtains in their future home. The young clerk, barely 18, looked at her with poorly hidden amusement. "Planning to redecorate the Morrison ranch, are we?" he asked with a smirk that made Margaret's cheeks burn. "Bit late to be starting a new home, isn't it?" Margaret set her coins on the counter with steady hands, though inside she felt like crumbling. "Everyone starts somewhere," she said quietly. "Sure they do," the clerk replied, but his tone said he thought some people started too late. Walking home, Margaret's arms full of purchases, she passed the schoolhouse where children played during their afternoon break. Their teacher, Miss Rodriguez, stood watching from the doorway. She was perhaps 25, with smooth, dark hair and kind eyes that had once looked upon Margaret with respect. Now those eyes held something else, pity, perhaps, or embarrassment for her. "Miss Sinclair," the teacher called out, her voice carefully neutral. "Congratulations on your upcoming marriage." "Thank you," Margaret replied, but she heard the careful politeness in the young woman's tone. It was the voice people used when they thought you were making a terrible mistake, but were too well-mannered to say so directly. One of the children, a gap-toothed boy of about 7, piped up loudly. "My mama says you're going to be the oldest bride in Arizona territory." "Tommy!" Miss Rodriguez scolded, but the damage was done. The other children giggled, and Margaret felt her face flame with humiliation. "That's enough playing for today," the teacher said quickly, ushering the children inside. But as Margaret walked away, she could hear their excited chatter through the open windows, her name mixed with words like old and funny and too late. By evening, when Daniel came to call, as he did every night, Margaret had worked herself into a state of near panic. They sat on the boarding house porch as usual, watching the sun set behind the mountains, but she couldn't find peace in the familiar ritual. "You're quiet tonight," Daniel observed, his weathered hands resting on his knees. He'd cleaned up from his day's work, his hair still damp from washing, his shirt pressed neat despite the long hours he'd spent mending fences. "I've been thinking," Margaret began, then stopped. How could she tell him about the cruel words, the stares, the growing certainty that everyone in town thought she was a fool? About what? His voice was gentle, patient. It was one of the things she loved about him. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give. About Saturday. About us. She twisted her hands in her lap, the simple gold band he'd given her feeling heavy as a chain. "Daniel, what if they're right?" "Who's right? About what?" Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation she'd been dreading. "The people in town. They think I'm too old for this. Too old for marriage. For starting over. For you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks now purple with twilight. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, rougher. "What people say doesn't change how I feel about you, Margaret. But what if it should?" The words burst out of her like water through a broken dam. "What if they're right, that this is all wrong? I've been alone so long, Daniel. What if I've forgotten how to be part of something? What if I'm too set in my ways, too difficult, too old to make you happy?" She was crying now, tears she'd held back all day, finally spilling over. Daniel reached for her hands, his calloused fingers warm and steady around hers. "Look at me," he said softly. And reluctantly she raised her eyes to his. In the fading light, his face was kind but serious. "Do you think I asked you to marry me because I felt sorry for you? I know, but do you think I'm the kind of man who makes important decisions based on what Mrs. Patterson thinks?" Despite her tears, Margaret almost smiled. "No, then trust me when I tell you that what I feel for you has nothing to do with your age or what anyone else thinks is proper." He lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I've been alone for 8 years, Margaret. 8 long years of empty evenings and quiet suppers and waking up to nothing but work and more work. You brought life back into my world." "But what if?" "No more what ifs," he said firmly. "The only question that matters is this. Do you want to marry me? Not because it's expected or proper or what anyone else thinks you should do, but because it's what you want. Because when you think about your future, you see me in it." Margaret looked into his eyes, brown like creek water over stones, lined with years of squinting into the sun, but warm with something that made her chest tight with hope and fear in equal measure. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I do." "Then that's enough," Daniel said. "Everything else is just noise." But as he kissed her goodnight and walked away into the gathering darkness, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that sometimes noise could be loud enough to drown out even the strongest love. The stolen horses were discovered missing at dawn on Thursday, just 2 days before the wedding. Margaret heard about it from Mrs. Presence Chen, who burst into the boarding house kitchen where Margaret was helping prepare breakfast, her usually calm face flushed with excitement and worry. 3 mares and Daniel's prize stallion, Thunder, Mrs. Chen announced to the room full of boarders, vanished in the night without a trace. Sheriff McKinnon thinks it might be the work of those bandits who've been hitting ranches south of here. Margaret's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. Daniel's horses, his pride and livelihood, gone just days before their wedding. The timing felt like a cruel joke, played by fate itself. But worse than her worry for Daniel was the reaction of the other people in the kitchen. She watched as meaningful glances passed between the boarders, saw the way Mrs. Chen's eyes flickered toward her, with something that looked uncomfortably like suspicion. "Strange timing," muttered Mr. Briggs, a traveling salesman who'd been staying at the boarding house for 2 weeks. "Right before the wedding and all. What's that supposed to mean?" Margaret asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Mr. Briggs shrugged, suddenly fascinated by his eggs. "Nothing, I'm sure. Just, well, some folks say unusual events happen when the natural order gets disrupted." The natural order. The phrase hit Margaret like a slap. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor, and walked out without another word. Behind her, she could hear the low buzz of renewed conversation, her name threading through it like a dark ribbon. Outside, the Arizona territory stretched endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Margaret walked toward the edge of town, her feet carrying her without conscious thought to the place where Daniel had proposed. The old fence post stood like a silent witness, and she gripped it with both hands, as if it could anchor her against the storm of doubt building in her chest. She didn't have to wait long before she heard hoofbeats approaching. Daniel rode toward her on his remaining horse, a sturdy bay mare named Patience. His face was grim with worry and exhaustion. He'd clearly been up all night searching for the missing animals. "I heard," Margaret said before he could speak. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." He dismounted and tied Patience to the fence post, his movements tired but still graceful. "Sheriff's forming a posse. We'll ride out within the hour to track them." "Any idea who might have done it?" "Could be the Martinez gang. They've been hitting ranches from here to New Mexico. Or maybe just drifters looking for easy money." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Doesn't matter who it was. I'll get them back." Margaret nodded, but she could see the strain in his eyes. The worry lines that hadn't been there yesterday. Those horses represented years of careful breeding, most of his savings, his future security. Their future security. "Daniel," she began carefully, "maybe we should postpone the wedding until this is settled and you get your horses back." Postpone? The word came out harder than she'd expected. Why would we do that? Margaret looked away, toward the distant mountains that seemed to mock her with their permanent, unchanging presence. "People are talking about the timing. They think maybe this happened because..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Because what, Margaret?" "Because I'm marrying you." The words came out in a rush. "Because it's unnatural for someone my age to be starting over, and God, or fate, or whatever is showing his displeasure." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed, not with humor, but with bitter disbelief. "You think my horses being stolen has something to do with you being 55 years old? I think people believe it does. And maybe people believe a lot of foolish things," Daniel interrupted. "That doesn't make them true. Margaret, those animals were taken by thieves, not by some divine punishment for your age. But what if nothing?" His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through his usual calm. "What if we spend our whole lives worrying about what might be wrong, instead of celebrating what's right? What if we let fear and superstition rob us of the happiness we've found?" Margaret felt tears prick her eyes again. She seemed to be crying constantly these days, and she hated it. 55 years old, and falling apart like a girl. "I'm scared, Daniel," she admitted. "I'm scared that marrying me really will bring you bad luck. I'm scared that I'm too old to learn how to be a wife, too set in my ways to make you happy. I'm scared that everyone in town is right, and I'm just a foolish old woman chasing after something she has no right to want." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where heat waves shimmered like water over the red earth. When he looked back at her, his eyes were softer, but no less determined. "You want to know what scares me?" he asked. "It's not bad luck, or gossip, or even losing every horse I own. What scares me is the thought of living the rest of my life, wondering what might have been if I'd let you walk away." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the dust and leather scent of him, could see the silver threading through his brown hair at the temples. "I was married before, Margaret, for 15 years to a good woman who died too young. I loved her, and when she passed, I thought that was it for me. Thought I'd had my chance at happiness and it was over." Margaret had heard bits of this story before, but never in Daniel's own words, never with the raw honesty she heard now. "I spent 8 years convinced I was done with love, done with hoping for anything more than just getting through each day. And then you walked into Morrison's Mercantile last spring, looking for thread, and you smiled at me like I was someone worth knowing, like I wasn't just another lonely widower counting down his days." "Daniel, let me finish." His hands found hers, warm and steady, and calloused from years of honest work. "You think you're too old? I'm 47, Margaret. I've got gray hair and bad knees, and a scar on my chest from when a bull decided he didn't like me very much. I get tired earlier than I used to, and sometimes I forget things that used to come easy. If we're talking about being too old, then we're both guilty." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, hers soft from years of indoor work, his rough from ranch life, both of them marked by time and experience and the simple act of surviving. "But here's what I've learned," Daniel continued. "Age isn't about the number of years you've lived. It's about whether you still believe there's something worth living for. And when I look at you, when I think about coming home to you every evening and waking up beside you every morning, I feel like I'm 25 again. The whole town thinks, the whole town can go to blazes," Daniel said with sudden fierceness. "Margaret, I'm asking you to marry me on Saturday, not because I feel sorry for you, or because I'm settling for less than I deserve. I'm asking you because in all my 47 years, I have never met a woman who makes me want to be a better man the way you do." Margaret felt her resolve wavering like a candle flame in the wind. But what if they're right about the bad luck? What if... Then we'll face whatever comes together, Daniel said simply. Good luck, bad luck, stolen horses, gossiping neighbors, we'll handle it all together. Because that's what marriage is, isn't it? Two people deciding that whatever life throws at them, they'd rather face it as a team than face it alone. In the distance, Margaret could see riders gathering near the sheriff's office, the posse preparing to search for Daniel's stolen horses. Reality pressed in around them like the desert heat, demanding attention and action. I have to go, Daniel said, following her gaze. But Margaret, I need to know, are you still going to be my wife on Saturday? Margaret looked into his face, weathered and worried but still kind, still patient, still looking at her like she was something precious instead of something past its prime. Yes, she said, and felt something settle in her chest, solid and sure as bedrock. Yes, I am. Daniel smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him since news of the theft broke. He kissed her quickly, a brief touch of lips that tasted like promise and determination. Then that's all I need to know, he said. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. As he rode away with the posse, dust rising behind the horses like a golden cloud, Margaret remained by the fence post. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust, and she thought about courage, how it wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Saturday was still 2 days away, 2 days for doubt to creep back in, for the town's whispers to grow louder, for fear to win over hope. But standing there in the vastness of the territory, watching the man she loved ride toward danger to protect what was his, Margaret Sinclair made a choice that had nothing to do with age or propriety or what anyone else thought was right. She chose love, consequences be damned. Gunshots echoed across the desert just after midnight, shattering Margaret's first peaceful sleep in weeks. She bolted upright in her narrow boarding house bed, her heart hammering as shouts erupted from the street below. Through her thin curtain, she glimpsed men on horseback racing past, their faces hidden by bandanas, dust clouds swirling in their wake. The Morrison ranch sat 3 miles outside town, and Margaret's blood turned to ice water as she realized where those riders were heading. She threw on her dress and boots, not bothering with her hair, and rushed downstairs to find the boarding house in chaos. Mrs. Chen stood in the hallway clutching a lantern, her face pale with fear. Horse thieves, Mrs. Chen whispered. They hit the Patterson place last month, took everything. Margaret's hands shook as she gripped the doorframe. Daniel kept his prize horses in the corral behind his house. Those animals meant everything to him, not just money, but his livelihood, his future, their future. By dawn, the terrible news had spread through town like wildfire. The notorious Velasco gang had struck the Morrison ranch in the dead of night, making off with 4 horses including Thunder, Daniel's prized black stallion. But worse than the theft itself were the whispers that followed Margaret wherever she went. Strange timing, isn't it? Mrs. Harwell muttered loud enough for Margaret to hear as she passed the mercantile. All these years, and the thieves choose now to hit Daniel's place, right after he gets mixed up with that woman. Margaret's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. At the post office, she overheard 2 ranchers discussing the robbery with knowing looks. My grandmother always said trouble follows when folks go against nature's plan, one said. A woman that age thinking she can play bride? It's asking for bad luck. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She had lived in this town for 3 years, working honest jobs, keeping to herself, bothering no one. But now, suddenly, she had become the source of everyone's problems. The unmarried woman who had dared to reach too high, bringing misfortune down on a good man. When Daniel returned from riding with the sheriff's posse that afternoon, his clothes were dusty, and his face grim with exhaustion. They had tracked the thieves for miles but lost the trail in the rocky hills to the south. His shoulders sagged as he told her the news, and Margaret saw something she had never seen before in his eyes: doubt. Maybe we should postpone the wedding, he said quietly as they sat on the boarding house steps. Just until things settle down. The suggestion felt like a knife to her chest, even though she had been thinking the same thing. "Of course," she managed to say. "That makes sense." But nothing made sense anymore. That evening, as Margaret served dinner to the boarding house guests, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. The traveling salesman spoke of other towns where similar thefts had occurred, always targeting the most successful ranchers first. The schoolteacher mentioned her students whispering about curses and bad omens. Even old Doc Martinez, usually the most sensible man in town, seemed troubled. "Superstition is a powerful thing," he told Margaret, as she refilled his coffee cup. "Sometimes it doesn't matter what's true or false. What matters is what people believe." That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the desert wind rattle her windows. She thought about Daniel's face when he had suggested postponing their wedding. She thought about the way conversations died when she entered a room. She thought about the note that had appeared under her door that morning, written in spidery handwriting. "Some women know their place." The worst part was the growing fear that maybe everyone was right. Maybe she had been foolish to think a 55-year-old woman deserved happiness. Maybe her very presence in Daniel's life was somehow poisoning everything good about it. By morning, Margaret had made her decision. She would leave Tucson before she caused Daniel any more harm. She would disappear quietly, the way she had lived most of her life, and let him find the kind of woman the town would approve of, someone young and fresh and untainted by whispers of bad luck. As she began folding her few dresses into her worn traveling bag, Margaret caught her reflection in the cracked mirror above her washstand. The woman looking back at her had silver threading through her brown hair and lines around her eyes, but there was still strength in her face, still dignity. For just a moment she wondered what would happen if she stayed and fought. What would happen if she refused to let other people's fears dictate her choices? But then she heard horses in the street below and voices calling Daniel's name, probably with more bad news about the search for his stolen animals. Margaret closed her traveling bag with trembling fingers. Some battles, she told herself, weren't worth fighting. Some dreams weren't worth the cost they demanded from everyone around you. The desert sun was climbing higher, promising another scorching day, and Margaret Sinclair prepared to disappear from Daniel Morrison's life as quietly as she had entered it. Margaret was stuffing her last clean blouse into her traveling bag when Daniel's boot steps thundered up the boarding house stairs, taking them two at a time. She froze, her hands gripping the faded fabric as his fist pounded on her door with an urgency that made her heart race. "Margaret, open this door right now!" She had never heard him sound like that, desperate, almost wild. Against her better judgment, she turned the key and found herself face to face with a man she barely recognized. Daniel's usually neat hair was disheveled, his shirt was torn at the sleeve, and there was something fierce and frightening in his blue eyes. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. His gaze swept over her packed belongings, and his jaw tightened. "Mrs. Chen told me she saw you settling your account this morning." Margaret lifted her chin, trying to summon the dignity that had carried her through 40 years of disappointments. "It's better this way, Daniel. For both of us." "Better?" The word exploded from him like a gunshot. "How is running away better for anyone? Your horses are gone because of me." The confession burst out of her, raw and painful. "The whole town believes I brought you bad luck. And maybe they're right. Maybe a woman my age has no business." "Stop." Daniel stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his presence filling the small space. "Just stop talking and listen to me." His voice had dropped to something quiet and dangerous, and Margaret found herself obeying despite her resolve to stay strong. "I rode with the posse for 2 days," he continued, his eyes never leaving her face. 2 days tracking those thieves through some of the roughest country in the territory. You want to know what I learned? Margaret's throat felt too tight to speak, so she just nodded. The Velasco gang has hit 12 ranches in the past 6 months. 12, Margaret. The Pattersons last month. The Kellys before that. The Rodriguez place in January. You know what those ranchers all had in common? She shook her head. afraid of where this was leading. Nothing, Daniel said flatly. Nothing, except they all owned good horses and lived far enough from town to make easy targets. No curses, no bad luck, no punishment for older women daring to find love, just greedy men taking what didn't belong to them. Margaret sank onto the edge of her narrow bed, her legs suddenly weak. But the timing was coincidence. Daniel knelt in front of her, his calloused hands covering hers. Pure, rotten coincidence that gave the gossips in this town something to wag their tongues about. "You don't understand what it's been like," Margaret whispered. "The stares, the whispers. Mrs. Harwell's daughter actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to me yesterday. They think I'm some kind of plague carrier." Daniel's hands tightened on hers. "And you're going to let them win? You're going to let a bunch of small-minded people who have nothing better to do than tear down anyone who dares to be happy run you out of town?" The pain in his voice cut through her defenses like a blade. She looked up to find his eyes bright with unshed tears, and the sight nearly broke her resolve. "I'm trying to protect you," she said desperately. "Can't you see that? Every day you're with me, your reputation suffers. Your business suffers. First the horses. And what's next? What if people stop buying from you because they think I'm bad luck? Then I'll find other buyers." His voice was steady now, certain. "I'll sell to ranchers in Phoenix, in Yuma, in California if I have to. But I won't lose you because of other people's ignorance." Margaret pulled her hands free and stood up, pacing to the window. Outside, the town was going about its morning business. Women hanging laundry, children chasing chickens, men loading wagons. Normal life for normal people who fit into neat, expected categories. "You say that now," she said without turning around. "But what about in 5 years? 10 years? When I'm an old woman and you're still in your prime? When everyone's predictions about our doomed marriage start looking true?" She heard him stand up, felt him move closer until his warmth was at her back. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you know what I prayed for every night after Elena died?" Despite herself, she found herself listening. "I prayed to feel something again. Anything. For 5 years, I went through the motions of living without really being alive. I worked my ranch, I ate my meals, I slept in an empty bed, and I felt nothing. Nothing at all." His hands settled gently on her shoulders. "Then you walked into Henderson's Mercantile that first day, arguing with him about the price of flour, and you were so fierce and proud and alive that something inside me woke up for the first time in years. I went home that night and thanked God for letting me feel hope again." Margaret closed her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't care what this town thinks," Daniel continued. "I don't care if you're 55 or 65 or 95. I care that when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be fully alive. And if I age faster than you do," she whispered, "if I become a burden, then I'll take care of you the same way you'd take care of me if our situations were reversed." His arms came around her from behind, holding her against his chest. "That's what love means, Margaret. It means choosing each other every day, regardless of what the world throws at us." For a long moment, they stood together in the silence of her small room, the weight of decision hanging between them like morning mist. Margaret could feel the steady beat of Daniel's heart against her back, could smell the familiar scent of soap and leather that always surrounded him. "I'm scared," she finally admitted. "I'm scared that loving you will ruin your life. And I'm scared that losing you will end mine," he replied simply. Outside her window, a mockingbird burst into song, its voice carrying across the desert morning like a promise. Margaret turned in Daniel's arms and saw her future reflected in his eyes, not the safe, lonely future she had planned, but something riskier and more beautiful than she had ever dared imagine. "All right," she whispered. "All right." The stolen horses thundered back into town just as the church bells began to ring. Margaret pressed her face against the boarding house window, watching Daniel lead the recovered animals down the dusty main street. Dust clouds swirled around the hooves, and townspeople poured from their shops to stare at the sight, "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Chen muttered from behind Margaret. "Looks like your bad luck story just fell apart." Margaret's heart hammered as she saw Daniel's eyes searching the crowd. When his gaze found hers through the window, he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in days. The horses weren't the only thing that had been found. Hope had returned too. But the wedding was supposed to happen in 3 hours, and half the town still thought she was cursed. "You still planning to go through with this fool business?" Mrs. Chen asked, though her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. Margaret turned from the window, her chin lifting in a way that surprised even her. "Yes, I am." The next 2 hours passed like a whirlwind. Daniel appeared at her door, still dusty from the trail, his face showing exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "The Castellanos gang had nothing to do with you or our wedding," he said, taking her hands in his calloused ones. "They've been hitting ranches for months. Sheriff caught them trying to sell my horses in Tucson." "So, the town was wrong," Margaret said, though she felt no satisfaction in being right. "The town is always wrong about something," Daniel replied. "Question is, do you still want to marry a man who smells like horse sweat and hasn't had a proper meal in 3 days? Margaret laughed, actually laughed for the first time since this whole mess began. "I suppose I can live with that." But as they walked toward the mission, Margaret noticed the stares hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd gotten worse. People whispered behind their hands, pointing at her blue dress, at the simple flowers Daniel carried. Mrs. Harwell stood in front of the mercantile with her arms crossed, shaking her head like she was watching a terrible mistake unfold. "Maybe we should wait," Margaret whispered as they climbed the hill toward the small adobe church. "Until people forget about all this." Daniel stopped walking. "Margaret, if we wait for people to stop talking, we'll be waiting until we're both in the ground." Father Martinez was waiting for them on the church steps, his weathered face kind but concerned. "Are you certain about this timing, my children? Perhaps when things settle." "We're certain," Daniel said firmly. Inside the dim church, only 5 people sat in the wooden pews. Sheriff Rodriguez and his wife, old Miguel from the stable, and surprisingly, the young schoolteacher, Miss Foster. Margaret had expected no one at all, so even this small gathering felt like a victory. As Father Martinez began the ceremony, Margaret found herself really listening to the words for the first time. "Do you, Margaret, take Daniel to be your husband? For better or worse, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer?" The "for worse" part seemed especially important right now. She looked into Daniel's eyes and saw her own fears reflected there, but also something stronger, determination. "I do," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small church. When Daniel spoke his vows, his voice cracked slightly on the words, "till death do us part." Margaret realized that at 55 and 42, they both understood how precious and limited time could be. The kiss was gentle, almost shy, but when Margaret heard Sheriff Rodriguez's wife sniffle and say, "beautiful," she felt something shift inside her chest. Walking down the hill as husband and wife felt surreal. The morning sun painted everything golden, and for a moment, Margaret could pretend the world was welcoming them. But reality returned quickly. As they passed the mercantile, Mrs. Harwell called out loudly enough for half the street to hear, "Shameful display. Woman her age should know better." Margaret felt Daniel's arm tense under her hand. But before he could respond, Miss Foster stepped forward. The young teacher couldn't have been more than 25, but her voice carried surprising authority. "Mrs. Harwell, I believe what we just witnessed was love. Something this town could use more of, don't you think?" The older woman's face reddened, but she said nothing more. As they walked toward Daniel's wagon for the ride to the ranch, Margaret realized something important had just happened. Someone unexpected had stood up for her. Not everyone in town was against their marriage. "Thank you," she whispered to Miss Foster as they passed. "Every woman deserves to be happy, Mrs. Morrison," the teacher replied with a small smile. Mrs. Morrison. Margaret tested the name in her mind as Daniel helped her into the wagon. After 55 years of being Miss Sinclair, she was finally someone's wife. The ride to the ranch gave them their first moments alone as a married couple. The desert stretched endlessly around them, painted in shades of red and gold by the morning sun. "Any regrets yet?" Daniel asked as the wagon bounced over the rough trail. Margaret considered the question seriously. The town's disapproval still stung. The whispers would probably continue for months. But sitting beside this good man, who had chosen her despite everything, she found her answer. "Only one," she said. Daniel's face fell slightly. "I regret waiting so long to say yes." His smile lit up the entire desert. The ranch house looked different in the soft light of evening 6 months later. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, her hands deep in bread dough, watching Daniel work with a new colt in the corral. The young horse had been wild when they'd found him, abandoned and scared, but Daniel's patient touch was slowly winning him over. "Some things just need time," Margaret murmured to herself, thinking about more than horses. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee, scents that had become as familiar as breathing. Margaret had discovered she enjoyed cooking for someone who appreciated every meal like it was a feast. Daniel never failed to praise her biscuits or ask for seconds of her stew. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see a young woman standing on the porch, clutching a small bundle and looking around nervously. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. The woman couldn't have been more than 20, with hollow cheeks and clothes that had seen better days. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept well in some time. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard in town that you might have work? I can clean, cook, tend animals. I don't eat much, and I work hard." Margaret's heart clenched. She recognized the desperation in the girl's eyes, the careful way she held herself like someone expecting rejection. "What's your name, dear?" "Lucy. Lucy Preston." The girl shifted the bundle in her arms, and Margaret realized it was a baby. "This is my son, Thomas. He's 4 months old." The pieces fell into place. An unmarried mother, probably cast out by her family, looking for any kind of work that would keep her and her child fed. "Come inside," Margaret said, stepping back to let them in. "You look like you could use a hot meal." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I can pay you back for any food. I just need—" "You need to sit down and let me take care of you for a few minutes," Margaret said firmly. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning," Lucy admitted. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, heating soup and slicing fresh bread, while Lucy sat at the table, holding her baby close. The little boy had Daniel's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. "Where did you come from?" Margaret asked gently, as she set the food in front of Lucy. "Phoenix. My father threw me out when Thomas was born, said I'd brought shame on the family." Lucy's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret could hear the pain underneath. "And Thomas's father? Gone before I even knew I was carrying." Lucy took a small bite of soup, then a larger one as hunger overcame caution. "I've been traveling from ranch to ranch, looking for work. Most places won't take a woman with a baby." Margaret understood. Single mothers faced impossible choices in 1879. Without family support, they often had nowhere to turn. The front door opened, and Daniel's boots sounded on the wooden floor. He stopped short when he saw Lucy and the baby. "This is Lucy Preston," Margaret said. "She's looking for work." Daniel's eyes took in the girl's thin face, the careful way she held her child, the worn condition of her clothes. Margaret watched his expression soften. "Can you handle ranch work?" he asked. "It's not easy. I grew up on a farm," Lucy said, sitting straighter. "I know horses, cattle, chickens. I can fix fence, mend harness, birth calves, whatever you need." Daniel looked at Margaret, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd been talking about needing help with the growing ranch, but they'd also been talking about the loneliness of having no family nearby. "There's a small cabin behind the barn," Daniel said slowly. "Hasn't been used in years, but it could be fixed up. Would that work for you and the boy?" Lucy's soup spoon clattered into her bowl. You mean it? You'd let me stay? Trial basis, Daniel said. See how it works out for everyone. That night, as Margaret and Daniel lay in their bed, listening to the desert wind, they talked about their decision. People will talk, Margaret said. Unmarried mother. Mysterious past. They'll probably say we're running some kind of house of ill repute. Daniel chuckled. Let them talk. We know who we are. Margaret smiled in the darkness. 6 months of marriage had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was that other people's opinions mattered far less than she'd always believed. Besides, Daniel added, that baby needs a good start in life. And Lucy reminds me of someone. Who? You. 6 months ago. Scared, alone, convinced the world had no place for her. Margaret turned to face him in the darkness. And now? Now I watch you run this ranch like you were born to it. You keep the books better than I ever did. You've got the best vegetable garden in the territory, and you make the cowboys feel like they've got a real home here. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I never thought I'd have a real home. Well, you do now. And so does Lucy, if she wants it. Over the following weeks, Lucy proved herself more than capable. She could indeed handle horses, mend fences, and cook for the cowboys. More importantly, she brought life to the ranch in unexpected ways. Baby Thomas became everyone's favorite, passed from hand to hand during evening meals, making even the toughest cowboys smile. Margaret found herself remembering what it felt like to be needed, to be part of something larger than herself. She taught Lucy to read and write better, while Lucy showed her new ways to preserve food and manage the chickens. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Lucy asked the question Margaret had been expecting. Why did you help me? Most women my age, they look at me like I'm something dirty. Margaret rocked baby Thomas gently, thinking about her answer. Because 6 months ago I thought my life was over. I thought 55 was too old to start anything new. Then Daniel showed me I was wrong. But that's different. You were just unmarried. Not what? Not someone who made a mistake? Not someone who needed a second chance? Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. Lucy, we all need second chances. Some of us just need them at different times. As the stars began to appear in the vast desert sky, Margaret Morrison understood that happiness wasn't something you earned by being perfect. It was something you created by being brave enough to believe you deserved it, and generous enough to help others believe the same thing. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and Margaret knew that some kinds of healing happened not just when you saved yourself, but when you reached back to pull someone else to safety too.